So you're now unmute on the.
Oh yeah, yeah. Cool. Do I start sitting or?
Okay, yeah.
Sit.
Hello everyone, welcome to the special seminar, not on our Friday slot, but the next week's seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, just to mention some of the other talks that we've got coming up. So tomorrow we have our regular seminar slot, and we've got Hugh Possingham, former Chief Scientist, Nature Recovery, to the Nature Conservancy, a range of other activities. So he's talking about the science impact nature conservation policy, stories of success and failure. That's at 4:15 p.m. Yeah, in the same place. I just mentioned a few the next few weeks. Next Friday, we've got Justin Adams from the Tropical Forests Alliance and various other things, boldly reimagining our approaches to nature recovery. The week after, we've got Philip Antwi Adjei from Ghana on climate change and rural livelihoods in Ghana. And on the 31st, we've got Amy Dickman on wildlife warriors and women, large carnivore conservation in Tanzania. So a nice range of talks coming up. And to introduce today's speaker, who this is the range of just about a week's notice, so we just together. It's really great to be able to do that. Tom Crowther is a professor of biodiversity at ETH in Zurich, and he's chair of the board of the UN Decade of Restoration. And he did his PhD, you see he'll cover a lot of things, but he did his PhD in wood rotting fungi in Cardiff with Heffron Jones, and a postdoc in Yale on soil microbiomes and bargaining and other places, and then moved on to ETH in Zurich, and where he now leads a lab of an impressive 40 researchers, along with various other people there. So I'm sure we'll hear what Tom and his lab are up to now. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks so much for making the time. Again, as Yadvinda said, a week's notice is pretty short, but I really appreciate the opportunity. It's amazing to be here and to interact with the incredible research that's going on in this space. So I titled this speech, because we need both an ecological, I guess we need a societal and we need a mindset shift if we're ever going to achieve an ecological one. I guess my girlfriend did mention that we could just delete the F to describe the current state of things, but ultimately we're talking about understanding the state of biodiversity now and how we can realign our societal values with the values that promote biodiversity on the planet. I start with a quote. Just clicking wrong. This was working a second ago. Sorry. Oh, sorry, my bad. So yeah, Stephen Wright said, to steal ideas, when you steal ideas from someone, it's plagiarism. But when you steal ideas from loads of people, that's fine. That's just research. That's the academic process. We are here not just to have ideas about the world, but to build consensus around those ideas by building the knowledge and expertise of others. And it's that consensus building that I think can be our most powerful tool actually at the moment in this sustainability challenge that we're all facing. It's not a coincidence that these are the sounds of relaxation, of wellness, of well-being. We've evolved in natural ecosystems that have provided everything that we've ever needed for our survival. And so it makes sense that we are dependent and relaxed by these incredible sounds and sights. And yet, obviously, those sounds of nature are fading. I think most of us have an inherent connection with nature, whether we know it or not. I personally am obsessed with nature. I spend a lot of time, in fact, this is what I would do in every of my available weekend hours, if possible. A thing called bushcrafting. Me and my friend Steve hang out in a forest, just trying to whittle things out of wood. My girlfriend would join, but she's terrified that bears are going to destroy us, and because she read an article saying bears can run faster than people, so she won't come. But it's that classic thing. I don't need to be able to run faster than the bear. I just need to be able to run faster than Steve, because ultimately we make a nice little ecological network by the existence of Steve. As long as I can run faster than him, means that I can survive. And so it's these networks that actually give a sort of structure to ecological systems that I'm really fascinated in. And so yeah, in my early work, we were interested in this topic, trying to understand how ecological networks bring stability. And we did a lot of work with wood rot fungi and how they interact and how they fight against one another. Here you can see we're going to call it fungus A fighting against fungus B. And fungus A is destroying fungus B and degrading all of its cytoplasm and breaking it all down and beating it in the Petri dish. And so fungus A is the dominant competitor in this case. But that's not always the case. Obviously, when we put fungus C in, fungus C actually beats fungus A, but it loses to fungus B. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with an intransitive network. This is a system where A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A, which actually means that within some Petri dishes, you can have a stable system which doesn't collapse into one individual Petri dish. Now, obviously, that's not very common. It's not always happening. But actually, what we found is that the more species we integrate into that system, the more likelihood we had of finding those intransitive networks. And once we got up to, so when we had 2 fungi in the Petri dish, it always collapsed into 1, or very commonly collapsed into 1. When we had 3, the frequency of collapse went down. When we had 4, it went down even more. Once we got up to 9 species, we would always maintain stability in that system. And so it's just a beautiful, I think, a very simple example of how diversity literally begets diversity. The more species we have, the more stability we have to maintain more species. And this is the magic, I think, of ecological systems. And so really in our lab now, we try to understand these systems at a global scale. Sorry for the dramatic music. This is actually a lag from a previous speech. Put that down a little bit. But so we try to sort of understand the structure of these networks all across the globe by pulling together data sets from experts all over the world who have studied the intricacies of their ecosystems. But then this also gives us insights to study how that links to human management decisions so that we can better understand how to manage and protect biodiversity across the globe. Much of that work, probably most of it until to date, has focused on the below ground world, the fungi, the magic of the mycorrhizal systems that literally give structure and functioning to the above ground world. They have very different biogeographic patterns, but by understanding the microbiome or the fungal biome, we can start to understand how those ecosystems function above ground. We do a lot of work on the soil microbiome, on the diversity, the most diverse ecosystem on the planet, and how they essentially govern our most valuable resource in the fight against climate change, which is the immense carbon stocks that exist below our feet. Here you can see the above ground carbon that we're all very much focused on promoting across the globe. And then you see that in contrast to the below ground carbon, and you see that we've got an enormous bomb of carbon below our feet, which is critical that we should be keeping this in the ground if we're going to be fighting against climate change have any hope of minimizing the effects of climate change. And obviously warming, as we know, is increasingly threatening this huge bomb that is in the higher latitudes in the cold regions of the world, where cold conditions have slowed down decomposition rates, leading to the accumulation of carbon. And when we alleviate those temperature limitations, that's when we're expecting to see carbon emissions in a pretty terrifying feedback loop. But our most controversial, and I would say most entertaining work as a result, has been on the global forest system, trying to understand the patterns of the biodiversity, the structure, the functioning of this global system. And so we've explored, the first study I did back in 2015 was on the density of forests across the planet, an important habitat characteristic of global forests. And we were able to show that our Earth is home to just over 3 trillion trees. When you know the density of trees across the world, you can understand population dynamics. Obviously, this was my first little insight into the world of media, and we got heavily criticized because we missed the trees in the Vatican City. So we had to update the number, but still 3 trillion and 12 is a massive scale of this global forest system, which is obviously a nice sort of insight into the scale of this system, but it really was about generating data that could help us to understand the ecological relationships between those forests. But those models they're essentially trained on information collected from the ground, from millions of scientists around the world standing on the ground, evaluating information about their forests. Those models are then paired up with satellite imagery and information about the climate and the topography and human disturbance. And when we remove human disturbance from those models, we could then start to see something else. We could see where forests might naturally exist, both in sort of bistable states or in individual, places where it would only be a forest. And you can start to see where trees can potentially grow. Now I'd highlight here how a sort of greeny yellow color is essentially, it's like somewhere around 10 to 20% tree cover. So this might be one tree in a field or something like that. But it starts to give us an understanding that there might potentially have been a lot more trees in the absence of human activity. But this was our most controversial finding that we've had in this process, because when we removed urban and agricultural lands and the existing forests from this model, we estimated there was a large area of land where nature could potentially, if we were to stop managing those landscapes, when in fact, these were the areas with very low human footprint, we estimated that there's the potential for a huge number of trees to recover. And those trees might capture a staggering amount of carbon from the atmosphere, both in the vegetation and in the soils below. Now that potential really changed the conversation around this topic. Until about 5 years ago, the sort of UNCCD process not CCD, the UNFCCC process had very few mentions of nature. The conversation around nature and climate was very separated, and intentionally so. But around 5 years ago, this paper just went to absolute carnage, and it was one of the initially most exciting, but soon to be the most scary experiences of my academic process. So the headlines just went viral. Suddenly, this alliteration of trillion trees just took over everything in my world. Then, this gave rise to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is a wonderful thing, trying to promote local livelihoods through the protection of grassland biodiversity and peatland and wetland and forest biodiversity. But then over time, the movement merged towards this focus on trees, and the WWF had their Trillion Tree campaign, which was to protect global forests. And then the World Economic Forum launched their Trillion Tree campaign, which was ultimately branded around the idea of planting trees. And this was a very different message from the original paper. But when the sort of governments and companies started pledging their commitments to forests, it was a very exciting time. But many of them were doing so with the right reasons, to promote biodiversity and livelihoods. But many also obviously saw this as an opportunity to just greenwash, to avoid the challenges of cutting greenhouse gas emissions and conserving the ecosystems that are so vital, and instead to just buy up land and plant vast monocultures of trees over grasslands and forests and natural ecosystems that would otherwise be fully functioning and supporting people. And so these vast monocultures are obviously a really damaging concept in the idea of the biodiversity movement and the climate movement. It gave rise to huge debates around whether nature is just a massive distraction from the climate conversation. There's a lot of scientists who would still argue that, in fact, we shouldn't be mentioning the word nature in the context of fighting climate change, because it's a big distraction from efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of validity in that perspective, albeit that nature is undoubtedly a part of this system. It also was really devastating for the biodiversity movement, because many people saw it as this mass plantation process, which is obviously nothing to do with healthy biodiversity that we all depend on. And it gave rise to a period of scientific sort of controversy that I think undermined the environmental movement for a little while, or at least around this topic of planting trees. I myself had a very hard time. We were criticized quite heavily for the scale of the potential. People said there's no way. In fact, scientists who I've worshipped my whole career criticized it quite heavily. I was called an armchair ecologist and more creative insults. But the headlines were also started to follow. They were highlighting, rather than the incredible potential and the values of nature that are provided to all of us, they started gradually to tip towards highlighting the risks of restoration done wrong. And while absolutely these headlines are, totally correct, it's absolutely clear that the wrong tree in the wrong place will do a lot more harm than good. Certainly these mass monocultures are certainly not what anybody would want on the world. I would also stress that this is literally the case for everything that has ever existed. If you stick a toothbrush in the wrong place, it will do more harm than good. It's not like it's not like trees are the problem. It's bad management decisions that are the problem. And this was a period where I was desperate to sort of, I was just desperate to fight back against these headlines. I was desperate to at least answer and give context for these headlines. But to go to my second quote of the trick, I took some advice from Jack Handy, who said, before you criticize someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. his reasoning was a bit different. It was, so then you're a mile away when you insult them and you have their shoes. But rather than fighting back, or rather than sort of butting heads, because all of these perspectives are entirely correct, instead we decided to go in a different direction with it and to build massive collaboration, to work with the many, many scientists who were supportive and also who were critical of that original research, and to build massive collaboration across forest ecologists and grassland ecologists around the world, pulling together data from millions of locations. We can start to rebuild these models to get a more robust understanding of the scale of this system. And so once we pull that data together, we can now start to recalculate both how much carbon is stored in the global forest system now, but also how much could potentially be captured. And the nice thing this time is that we could pair up so many data-driven approaches from the ground all the way to the satellite-based approaches. And that showed, in fact, that we weren't overestimating, we were actually slightly underestimating that potential of global forests back in 2019. But the difference is this time we could explain how, and we can have context because we had so much more data with so many more models. Because of course, the power of nature, as I mentioned in the beginning, is in its biological complexity, where every species depends on other species to survive. And so we were able to calculate that actually diverse forests capture over 50% more carbon than the single species monocultures that would otherwise do so much more harm. And this time, that message started to come through more clearly. And so we could say, yes, diverse forests it's the diverse forest that can help us with a third of our climate goals. It's not just mass plantations or individual tree monocultures, but it can only happen if we also continue to cut emissions. Of course, if climate change is allowed to persist, if our emissions continue to go up, then increases in droughts and forests and fires and floods and extreme events are only going to deplete the potential of that forest system further. And we calculated that it would be somewhere in the order of 20 to 30% by 2050 would be at least threatened or in danger of losing massive scale carbon capture. So it's crystal clear that we can't be achieving our climate goals without nature, but we also can't be achieving our nature goals without climate. We categorically need both. And the separation between the two is something that absolutely has to end in our conversation around climate. And this time I was over the moon with the headlines. This time it was so much nicer. I was terrified before these headlines came out. This time it all went okay. We had good comments also from scientists who said the research provided clarity and confidence in the role. We had, saying they were foundational and correct, and even our harshest, but I think one of our wisest and harshest critics from 2015 summarized the work of hundreds of scientists over 4 years as reasonable, which was my best success in my entire career so far. We collaborate a lot, Simon and I, and this was like the best feedback I could have hoped for. And this was really exciting though, because it also built a platform on which policy could start to move. In 2015, it was all headlines and billionaires making pledges, whereas this time round, I got calls from people in the EU restoration law, people in Brussels who are, negotiating and fighting to protect nature around the world, who told me crystal clear that it's not the findings, it's nothing to do with the numbers, but it's the consensus building around the topic that gave them such a platform to move forward on this EU restoration law. Of course, with many other ecological studies as well. But the value of that consensus building to them is overwhelmingly the most useful thing. To have estimates that summarize all the different approaches, representing the perspectives of many, many ecologists, that was the thing that gave them sort of foundation to move forward. And that was, for me, by far the most exciting thing. Now, I should essentially take a step back at this point, because here I've been talking about the role of nature and interacting with climate. But of course, that's just a tiny piece of the puzzle. In reality, the challenge here is that, we've all seen what happened with the EU restoration law. It struggled and collapsed ultimately because there have been people marching in the streets of cities all across Europe, all across the world, fighting against such a nature protection law because they're scared that nature will come at the expense of agriculture, of food production, of our economy, of our jobs. And these are genuine and understandable concerns. It absolutely makes sense at a certain scale that you would imagine that nature comes at the expense, that there is a trade-off between nature and our agriculture. This is obviously the most fundamental challenge facing our environmental movement? Is this concern? And it's one that most of us, I think, would share. If you're a farmer, you would absolutely understand that a diverse forest on your land is not very productive for your crops. But actually, the challenge is at a continental scale that all the evidence points in the other direction. We, in fact, need nature in order to have agriculture. If we were to remove the Amazon rainforest, we lose food production in North and South America. I think there's about 8 civilizations have actually collapsed because of the large-scale collapse of nature, and then the societal collapse comes quite shortly afterwards. So the dependence of our agricultural system on nature is absolutely clear. But there's also a growing body of evidence that points in the other direction too, because when we, in the rare examples where some of the poorest sectors of society, who are often those most closely associated with land, when they are often, in many scenarios, when they are lifted out of poverty, they gain access to the resources to find sustainable options, and those sustainable options always come with better ecological resilience. An ecologically living ecosystem is always, in every location on the planet, is always more valuable to people than a degraded location. And so with these concepts, it's quite clear that both nature and people are interdependent. And what I mean by, and this sort of, in order to sort of frame that conversation, I must be clear on exactly what I mean when I talk about global restoration, when we talk about biodiversity protection. Of course, the first things first is that we must protect the nature that we have left. We estimate that about 64% of the potential of global forests, of that potential for additional carbon capture, comes from protecting the ecosystems that we have now. The average forest on our planet is about 30 to 40% of its full capacity. They're usually quite degraded and secondary growth forests, and allowing them to recover and grow back to maturity was the largest proportion of the potential for carbon sequestration in forests. But it also means to restore what has been degraded or what's been lost. And that doesn't, when we talk about restoration, that doesn't mean bringing back nature at the expense of people. It means bringing back nature for people. It means empowering, or it means local community-driven initiatives to bring back nature. So ultimately, it's about the management of biodiversity in degraded landscapes. And of course, that doesn't just mean buying up all of these degraded landscapes and planting loads of trees. If you do that, you're just going to get a load of dead trees and a load of angry people. Ultimately, what we need to be doing is restoring the ecological integrity, including, as I mentioned at the beginning, the microbiomes. We estimated from about 600 studies around the globe that on average, when you look at vegetation recovery in degraded sites, in the presence or absence of a healthy, intact microbiome, the average increase in growth was 64%. And that actually, that's an average of across a huge gradient. So in some sites, there was very little change. In other sites, there was 700% increases in plant productivity. This is both in agricultural settings and in natural settings. And what we found is this huge variation is strongly correlated with aridity. So in the more arid regions of the world, that microbiome is even more vital. It's critical to have healthy microbiomes in order for plants to be able to recover. And of course, that microbiome needs to be site-specific. It's region-specific. In a tropical forest, it's going to be an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal dominated system, whereas in a high-latitude Canadian forest, it would be ectomycorrhizal fungi. In a grassland savanna, it would be also the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And you need to, by working with what the natural microbiome can provide, we can accelerate the rates of ecological recovery. Obviously, the same is true for the animals. Without animals, we don't have the movement of spores and seeds. They're the vectors, the moving vectors of the ecological system, and those services are absolutely critical. We had a paper just a couple of, I think a week or so ago, showing that actually in fragmented tropical forests, when ecosystems are so fragmented that they lose large frugivorous birds, we actually lose the regeneration potential of those forests by about 38%. So even if the ecosystem was allowed to recover, it would be 38% less mature. It would have 38% less carbon storage than it would have if the animals were allowed to move through. And that's because larger animals move larger seeds, and larger seeds give rise to larger late succession tree species, which are the ones that store the majority of carbon in those tropical forest systems. And that study suggested that if you fragment a system so much that you've tipped below 40% tree cover across the landscape, that there was a, I wouldn't call it a tipping point, but that seems to be a threshold below which most of these large birds will leave a landscape. And at that point, ecological recovery is almost impossible. But of course, the most important, by far the most important, is the humans. Ecosystems are not going to recover unless people want them to recover there. Nature will not thrive unless the local communities are both driving it and being empowered by the recovery of nature. And it's for that reason that many of the scientists from that collaborative study and thousands of others across the globe have joined forces to build an organization called Restor. Oops. Restor is analogous. Well, it was actually built with Google. So it was originally, we used to call it the Google Maps for restoration. But I think it's actually more analogous to something like an Airbnb, but if it was a not-for-profit version of Airbnb, where the marketplace creation of Airbnb has just been the staggering contribution that organization has had. Bed and breakfasts, until Airbnb came along, were not really a thing. They were, I don't even know how you found bed and breakfast before Airbnb, but they weren't a very frequented thing. Whereas now, since the creation of Airbnb, we all have access to the whole world's bed and breakfasts across the globe. Wherever you are, you have access to this stuff. I'm not trying to promote Airbnb too much. I'm just saying that by opening up visibility and connectivity to these thousands and thousands of local businesses, suddenly there's a marketplace, $8.5 billion a year marketplace that exists solely because of the creation of an organization that just helped to find where everyone was. And that's ultimately the vision of Restor. It's to find the local landowners who are the protectors, the promoters, the stewards of biodiversity across the globe. So that's the farmers, indigenous populations, any land steward, and that could be managing biodiversity in any direction. There's no preference for organizations that are trying to achieve one thing or another. There's no goals around what the targets should be. The goals are entirely set. The goals are fundamentally driven by the local landowners who live there. So this is, it's now a database of around 240,000 projects, and it is really growing exponentially, where people are able to both find one another, connect, and learn and grow together. So on Restor, like actually quite a few platforms that exist now, you can draw around any location on the planet, and you get insights. Well, you essentially get access to the academic literature. You get access to information about biodiversity and carbon and water, all the things that we've got global models of. We can estimate those things in any of those locations. And that means landowners, it sort of democratizes the access to data to those landowners across the globe, many of which have access to that data already and are excited to share, many of which have no access to that information, and it's quite useful for their decision making. This is one example that I love to share. I know it because this Restor's coffee is sold in Zurich, where I'm living, and Restor is a farmer in Ethiopia. You can see the footprint of traditional. This is the Kaffa region where coffee originally came from, actually, and you can see the massive footprint of agricultural coffee production, where the forests have been removed to grow coffee, understandably. But as you can zoom into Restor's, you see it's quite different. That is an intact, beautiful tropical forest with birds and animals moving throughout it. And that's because that's exactly what it is. It's essentially Restor, instead of removing the forest, he plants native coffee species underneath the existing canopy, and that canopy traps water and nutrients. So his trees grow without the need for fertilizers or irrigation. And as a result of that, his coffee production is actually cheaper than it is in all of the surrounding farms. And because he sells it in Zurich as an organic coffee, his business is absolutely thriving because nature is doing well in his farms. And because of that, when nature is the economic preference, when nature is the choice of people, that is when you cannot stop it from recovering, because all the farmers in the nearby area have realized actually they could allow trees to grow back on their lands, and they can have more productive coffee production in the process. So when nature is that economic preference, those are the holy grail situations that we're all looking for. And of course, on Restor, Restor gains access to things about, which species grow there. You can learn about which types of organisms should be in the area and which ones are highly likely to be in the sites. He's used that to actually select some of his coffee strains that are native in the region. He also gets information, obviously, about the carbon storage estimated above ground and below ground. You can see the impacts of his land management decisions. Interestingly, about a quarter of the site had been removed of vegetation in 2012, and you shortly see a sort of recovery of the site. I don't know if that's just variation in the primary productivity data. It might just be natural variation, but it correlates quite nicely with his land management decisions. And many people are using this to be able to track where their interventions started and what the impacts have been. But by far the most valuable to Restor is the visibility. He's now connected to his customers. So if you go to Restor's shop, you can see an iPad where it shows you the farm, and he tells us that as a result of this, so many of his customers say they'll never go and get a Starbucks ever again, because now they can get better tasting coffee, and they can see not only the minimal environmental footprint, they can learn about the ecological system, they can learn about his practice, they can learn about the process, and they can see every individual tree from which their coffee comes, which gives them an empowerment. It empowers the customers. And what you can see on the left-hand side here is this 93%. This is the seed biocomplexity index, an index that essentially gives a globally standardized estimate of how intact the biological complexity of that location is. So it's not focused on any individual species, but it tells you how close the complexity of that pixel is to the natural complexity of that site. And so you can see, wow, okay, when I buy a Restor's coffee, I'm having a positive impact. You can even find his product in the shops, and you can scan it with your phone, and you can see you can go again and see the site, and you can start to be connected to where your products are coming from, which is obviously empowering to people who everything that we use and engage with has a footprint on the land. And right now, as I mentioned, there's hundreds of thousands, and it's a massively growing community of projects that exist all over the world. And the more visible they become, the more plugged into this marketplace they become. So it's now engaging us, the users, to be able to buy products and donate and volunteer and go on ecotourism trips in this slowly but gradually evolving marketplace that exists across the world. But now that we have this, it's a really useful resource to scientists. For the first time ever, well, I would argue for the first time ever, we have a truly transparent, fully global set of projects that show us where restoration and conservation efforts are happening. So about 155 million hectares of land, all owned by the local land stewards, who you can connect directly to. You can learn information about their social structure. You can learn about the number of employees. You can learn about whether the projects are primarily driven by indigenous people or women or men. You can get all of this social information about all these sites, and it's starting to help us to build a new level of sort of consensus understanding about what restoration means and where it works and where it fails. Obviously, you've probably all seen lots of examples of where, for example, restoration of forests can warm or cool the planet. In many places, they have a cooling effect, but they can also have huge warming effects in regions where they reduce the albedo of the planet, particularly in high latitude regions where snow would otherwise reflect a lot of heat. Forests can have a very warming impact in those local areas. And there's been a lot of debate around whether forests are positive or negative for those impacts. In fact, this isn't just forests, this is vegetation in general. And so the first paper just came out on that, sort of exploring the impact of Restor's global movement on the warming or cooling of local effects. And Susan Cook-Patton's group from TNC were able to look at how each of those sites was having the relative warming versus cooling impact of all those sites, showing that I think 86% of the sites were having a cooling impact, but the ones with a warming impact were often in those high latitude regions where where freezing conditions are actually one of the big challenges to biodiversity. And so the local warming effect of vegetation is obviously a very beneficial thing for microbes and things in the soil. But of course, there's lots of regions where vegetation does have a warming impact, and it's a very complex and challenging dynamic to predict. But even more exciting, now we have a tool for standardized reporting for countries. So the FAO is now using Restor to report on the national targets that countries have set towards their biodiversity targets set in Montreal. So the commitments of the CBD were to promote that we're to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity across the globe. The 30 by 30 initiative is a really important initiative to try and promote the conservation of a third of the land surface. And all these countries have made pledges to try to be nature positive, whatever that means. Calculating what exactly those things mean is a big challenge, but at least now we can start to monitor how they're doing along the way. So if you click on any of these countries, you can get the summaries for the status of each of those countries and how they're doing towards those targets. You can see the thousands of sites and the thousands of different land uses across those countries, and that can obviously give us insights into how management practices are changing. But I've chosen the example of Costa Rica because this is an exemplary national scale intervention that has really, it's a very famous example of biodiversity intervention across the globe, where 30 years ago, the government of Costa Rica essentially abolished the army, and they used a lot of that money to distribute, well, they used it for education, and they distributed it to local landowners to compensate, to promote biodiversity, and those finances would compensate them for the losses of agriculture as a result of biodiversity recovery. And the goals of that biodiversity recovery were to improve carbon, water, and the beauty of nature. And obviously, this is one of the most famous good news stories about the distribution of wealth. The tree cover in the country went from something like 20 to, I don't know the numbers, like 20 to 70%, or it's staggering increases in ecological connectivity across the country. But it's still not been possible to actually assess what really happened to the ecology. So we can measure things like the carbon and the tree cover and the productivity dynamics, but to actually understand what's happening to the ecological integrity has been a real challenge until I think we can start to unpack this challenge. Now that we know the locations of all those sites, we can start to unpack it with biodiversity data like this bioacoustics study that we've just recently completed. So we had Costa Rican students all over the country in sites in all different types of sites where these payment for ecosystem service program projects were happening. And what they did is they would put bioacoustics monitors on trees and leave them there for 3 days. And this gave us an average soundscape for different ecosystem types. So we've got here, this is the soundscape. What you're hearing now is the soundscape of an intact, natural tropical forest. So these are the places, the reference sites, the sites that were unaffected by human activity. In fact, they were never deforested. In contrast, this is the soundscape of the pastures. So these are the other end of the reference site. So the soundscape of what we would call the non-natural reference site, where you can still hear the sounds of certain birds, certain insects, but ultimately the frequency variation is very, very different, particularly during the time of the dawn chorus. But the average across all of the payment for ecosystem service sites, at least the natural regeneration ones, sounds a little bit more like this. As you can hear, a lot of the ecological integrity has obviously returned to a lot of these sites. And in fact, we estimated on average, it's about 86%. This 86 number keeps coming up in my world. 86% of the soundscape has recovered to its, but from the yellow line to the green line, the blue line is 86% of the way along that trajectory, which is obviously incredibly exciting. And what you hear now is the sounds of howler monkeys. And you don't get howler monkeys or large animals like that unless you've got a really flourishing, intact ecosystem with a lot of the foods and resources that are necessary to maintain such body mass, which means that there are people on the planet, there are landowners across the country who have revitalized, who have brought back this soundscape to our world, which is an incredible thing, but they've done so at a national scale across thousands and thousands of hectares of land where people and nature are actually doing well together. And the other exciting thing about this is that we were able to compare these soundscapes to the sounds of music. In fact, we downloaded the most frequently downloaded, the 1,000 most frequently downloaded songs in history, and we just did a PCA and statistically compared that soundscape. When you look at the frequency variation and the timing of musical notes, and they sound statistically closer to the natural site than they do to the degraded one. And I think that stems obviously from our evolution in these ecosystems, where mixtures of high and low frequency sounds indicate different foods and resources that are available for us to survive. And so it makes sense that we've tuned our musical preferences. There's a huge amount of musical theory in this that's published on this topic, but how we've essentially attuned our musical preferences to reflect those of more diverse sort of soundscapes. That obviously doesn't mean that Lady Gaga sounds like a howler monkey. It just means that the timing and the frequency variation of these soundscapes is something, it's somehow built into our feeling, into the way we into the way we feel and sort of experience the process of nature. Categorically, we tend to be happier in more diverse ecosystems that provide resources. But now, of course, the most important thing in this whole story is that this all happened during a time of economic growth for Costa Rica, showing, just like Desta's, that this is an example where nature can be that economic choice, but at a national scale. So this is really exciting, and for us, this collaboration was made possible by the Prince William's Earthshot Prize, and they are now encouraging loads of other governments to follow similar practices, because ultimately the message is that the environmental restoration isn't an environmental challenge, it's not an ecological challenge, it's a social challenge. Because if we distribute the wealth of our planet to the local land stewards of nature, that is when they are able to find the resources that can ultimately move them towards a more sustainable outcome. And that sustainable outcome always does better for nature. And as a result, it does better for all of us. So I think it's a really exciting time if we can embrace that wealth distribution challenge. So I'll leave it there and hand over for some questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we can open up to questions from the audience. I'll kick off with one. You had this analogy to Airbnb, Restor, and Airbnb, to various degrees of success, it has some sort of quality control, so you don't have so many crooked operators or dubious things. Doesn't always work, I know from experience. How do you, with this thing, how do you check if these are genuine activities? You have certain sort of standards that need to be met before it qualifies?
No, there's no standards to qualify. Anyone can come on and anyone can do anything. And in fact, we would encourage the bad projects to come on. I want one day for us to be in aisles being able to say, oh, you know, scanning 2 products and going, oh, I'll choose that one, not that one. But hopefully that would only empower the more biodiversity negative ones to move towards in a positive direction. I think it's only when we bring everyone to the table that we'll be able to do that. But we do have sort of, I don't want to call it validation, but more like a verification process. There's a 4 or 5 step verification process where ultimately all they need to do is prove that they are the people owning that land. And so we can rate the projects by how open they are across those 5 steps. So we just ask people to share information. It's voluntary information, but if they share land tenure information, that's very useful. If they share some validation information, that's obviously very useful. There's these 4 or 5 steps that if you can meet all of those steps, then you will get a sort of high rating on this transparency score. So if, for example, a company wants to invest in loads of local community-led projects, we can find 10,000 that have scored 5 out of 5 on the transparency score. So it's sort of more of like a transparency validation than we're not saying they're doing good things or they're doing bad things. We're not the ones to judge what anyone should do with their land. But yeah.
Okay, great. Anna?
I understand. So I have 2 questions, one kind of drawing off the Airbnb analogy again. Sorry to really go into that, but with Airbnb, they have found that it actually increases housing prices, and I'm sure you've heard of that. But do you have any fear that this potentially could fall in the way of Airbnb, where essentially people do make a lot of money, then aggregate the land ownership, because land ownership itself can be inherently unequal in terms of gender, in terms of history? I mean, you just look at land ownership in England as well and think about how that's impacted historically over 300 years and more. That's a lot. That's a big question, but I guess I combined the two.
Yeah, no, it's the main question that we're struggling with, and it's the one that I will never have. I don't have an answer for, and I won't. But we obviously think a lot about, and it's all ultimately comes down to our governance. So every time anything is successful, whether it's a marketplace or a whatever, Airbnb, an app, that ultimately the more energy and finances that go into it, the more inequity you tend to drive. There's this classic thing that the more valuable it becomes, the more it drives inequity. So yeah, Airbnb, there's loads of examples of rich people just buying up loads and loads of properties, and then they get richer, and local homeowners don't have any of the benefit. And essentially that is our major fear going into Restor. Equitable distribution of wealth is our only goal. And so we're hoping that that in itself as a principle is going to be a defining feature. But we've also got our board is represented 40% by indigenous people and then 20% by farmers. And so we're hoping that just by having this sort of equitable distribution and the board governance plan explicitly focusing around this challenge, we're hoping that we're going to make the decisions that will keep things going in the right direction. At this scale, when it's tiny, it's all good. It's just Esther's getting a bit of extra money, but
yeah, I guess
if it got massive.
Do you have any evaluation plans to check up on that in like a couple years' time, or have you built that into how you assess the effects of bio?
I think we need you on the board. I honestly, no, not at this stage. We're still very small. Restor is it's like 8 people in Zurich and 25 people around the global south. And we don't have capacity for it yet. What needs to happen is it is a for-profit, no, it's a not-for-profit organization, but it can make revenues. So the more revenues it brings in, hopefully we're going to build in that capacity to do deeper verification and also deeper tracking of where the money flows go. This is absolutely our top priority. Well, that along with, we've also got nerves around tenure rights. I'm scared of people drawing around someone else's land and claiming it as their own. But so those are our main governance challenges that we're going to face.
Thanks for the great presentation. You talked about the trade-off between agriculture and restoration. So do you think there's a trade-off between agricultural intensification, specifically livestock, and restoration? Because it's often said that if we can intensify agricultural as well as livestock production, there can be more land available for restoration, but that isn't a good thing, really. So what are your views on that?
I agree with you that it's not a good thing. I was gonna, suggest. I mean, first, if nothing else, even if we did become 10 times more productive on the smaller amount of land, it's not like everyone's just going to give up their land for free. Then they're still going to use that land for other things. I do believe that there are synergies and trade-offs in different areas. Of course, the trade-offs they seem more obvious because at a global scale, essentially what happened, really we've got inequitable distribution of wealth, which is the ultimate driver of degradation. We've got rich people in cities and poor people living in association with land, and they are forced to live on very short financial cycles, which means they have no capacity to explore the sustainable solutions. And so I believe that if we can alleviate some of those restrictions, then the sustainable solutions can move from trade-offs to synergies. And in all the places where we've got tens of thousands of examples where agroforestry and things are increasing productivity, or when mixed cropping can increase productivity. So I personally believe that there's an option for the synergy in every location on the planet. But interestingly, we did do just a very coarse assessment with the FAO data, because they've got actually 20 or 30 years of yield data from every country on the planet. So if you just take every country, and if you just look at the relationship between the change in yield versus the change in forest cover, what the state of the planet is now is that the global north countries tend to do worse when forests are lost. So the more deforestation is, the productivity goes down, yields go down. currently in most of the global south, it's still the opposite trend. So it's still like, you know, when you cut down forests, you have more room for agriculture, so yields go up. But I believe that I think this is the kind of data we'll be able to look for tipping points to say how much forest do you lose before the relationship flips? And I think, yeah, it's an area I'm really keen to focus our whole lab's research on actually in the coming years. Yeah, we're right next to each other.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Otherwise I can't.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I was really interested in hearing about your country scores. First of all, what was your base? I mean, what was your baseline year for that? And then also, I mean, I see quite a lot of potential for this being used now with nature performance-linked sovereign bonds and things coming, you know, gaining traction. So I wonder whether this score could be used for that, and whether you've had some conversations around that. Or
Yeah, it's a great question again. The baseline, so it's actually FAO who manages the reporting for target 2 on the for the CBD, and they haven't decided yet what the baseline is at this point. So it's not like what we can do is estimate the potential, you know, each of those graphs has the potential for carbon storage and the actual carbon storage. So you can say how close you are to you can say it's 84 this year and it's 83 next year and it's 82 next year. So you can do changes in potential. You can also do changes in like vegetation cover, but the baseline is not yet defined.
because you had that one score was actually also meaning, you know, a temporal a baseline. Is it 2020 from where you start measuring?
So, well, the graph that I showed changing over time, the productivity graph, that I think was, that just goes back as far as Sentinel or MODIS,
Oh, yeah.
the satellite imagery goes, you know, so it's just changing since as soon as the satellite imagery was available. So I think it's 30 years now.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really great. And great to also speak a bit before about your change in interest into the area of economics around restoration. And this is more of like a conceptual sort of question on the long-term economic gain of people who switch maybe farming to something that's more that's better for biodiversity, and maybe we can like focus in on the Costa Rica example where people were paid and there was like this huge shift in the country. I wonder how that was done. Was it like a once-off payment, or was it ongoing? So is there like an economic long-term incentive for people to change their land use?
Yeah, the Payment for Ecosystem Service Program has ongoing payments. I'm not going to say that every farmer in Costa Rica is happy with it. A lot of them hate it, a lot of them love it. And in many cases, it's not enough to compensate the loss of their agricultural productivity. But what is interesting is the economic increases that have happened at a landscape scale and a national scale are really tangible. So I met the environment minister for Costa Rica a few months ago, and I said, look, I'm always giving these speeches about how good Costa Rica is. I say it's a correlation, right? Because I don't know we don't really know why the economy went up and nature went up together. What's that all about? And he went, absolute nonsense. It's definitely causal. He's like, I can show you how ecotourism boomed, then our sustainable economy started improving. If you travel around Central America and you go into Costa Rica, not only is the identity of most people tangibly linked to nature, you can feel the pride in nature, but there's so many sort of like vegan stores and coffee, like there's a green vibe to the whole economy, and he's convinced, he says he's got lots of evidence that is causally linked to the improvements in the economy at a large scale. So yeah, this is always the trade-off though, because the local landowner, it's a bad decision, but the national scale, it's a good decision. So teasing those apart, the economists have a big challenge ahead.
Yeah, and it's like wondering if we're altruistic enough. If we're altruistic enough for that to be a long-term way for us to live.
And that's a good point, because actually they've run out of money. The Payment for Ecosystem Service Program was started because they abolished the army. It is now run out of money, and they get a lot of their money from carbon credits, actually. And what we'd want is the global north to be cancelling debts and donating and distributing wealth. But the mechanisms for wealth distribution are pathetic right now. And I think that's the whole challenge we face.
Yeah, let's just get it over
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, do you plan for Restor to also play a role in helping defend the land rights of Indigenous and local peoples? Because it seems like it could have potential for that, especially against, for example, carbon offsetting and tree planting mechanisms, which use that to justify land grabs, which was one of the fallouts of the previous work.
Yeah.
And also kind of linked to that, whether, I mean, there's the species, the ecosystem, and the carbon data, which is really interesting. If you're exploring mapping other types of values for land through the map as well.
Again, that would be the dream. If I had an example of it, I would be singing about it in all my speeches. But I do believe there's an incredibly strong capacity for that to be used as a sort of like, yeah, we've got loads of Indigenous communities who've drawn around the forest that they steward. I don't know of any examples yet of where that has helped them in an argument about land tenure, but we are just beginning a collaboration with an organization who's been explicitly working on that for like 20 years. I can't remember the name of the organization. It's got the word tenure in it and it's got the word Indigenous peoples in it, but I can't remember the organization. But they're not geospatial, they're not scientists, but they've worked with loads of Indigenous people to secure tenure rights or to secure land rights to loads of places, and we're hoping to get them all visible on Restor. I think a lot of them already are on Restor, but if we can get all of them and sort of like build that narrative around it, it would be amazing. Yeah, that would be amazing. And yeah, in terms of collecting non-ecological data, obviously ecological data is easier because we've got loads of scientists around the world making models and we can ingest it. It's hard to get social data. We have an app at the moment that we're trialing with quite a lot of the communities where it's verbal. You can just speak and describe the values of the ecosystem, and it does, I think, something like 12 different languages, and it's really cool. It's like the person doing it gets, I think, something like 10 cents for every statement they make, and that then gets summarized into a sort of PCA of like concepts of what the ecosystem's like. But it's very, 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 very early, and we're trying to figure out how to ingest that kind of information. But again, that will be hard because it's only ever from someone who did it. I can't interpolate that into a map. So it can never be. One of our principles is that everything on Restor is available to anyone, anywhere, wherever you draw your site, you get all the information. So it's hard to, we're going to have to figure out how we do that, like individually reported information. Yeah. Yeah.
Just one last question. I was wondering if the Costa Rica model is replicable and scalable across the world, because this is like a one-off country with the perfect conditions. And I'm wondering if, the bread baskets of the world, like India and the countries which are really the economic engines of the world, can they really switch over to something like Costa Rica without compromising food security and economic collapse, risking of economic collapse?
All I can, yeah, I obviously can't answer that. That would be, if I knew that answer, it would be incredible. Of course, it's going to be difficult, infinitely more difficult for some countries than others. Although I would ask you, what specific reasons would you say that Costa Rica was a uniquely good opportunity for that?
Wasn't it always green, from what I know?
So when I speak to Cristiana Figueres, who's the daughter of the president that made that decision, she's like, no, we had nothing of it in our identity before the Payment for Ecosystem Service program. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if she's in favor of it because her dad did it, but I am told by everybody who I've encountered in the process that the feeling of greenness, the pride in nature has evolved over the last 30 years. And so I don't know. I do believe that a pride in nature can be beneficial to all countries. But yeah, we've got a lot of challenges.
But smaller countries are easier to manage. Singapore, for example.
Right. And the proportion of the GDP that's based on agriculture is obviously a major determinant of how easy it's going to be. And in fact, I mean, all the global South countries, that's a major driver. The global North countries, it's much easier. Yes, essentially, I think it's going to be more challenging for some than others, but I do believe wealth distribution, in order to promote a sort of connection with nature, I have to believe that that's one of our best avenues. Okay.
Okay. Great. And we can wrap up now.
Thank you so much.